What's going on, guys? Today I wanted to bring you another one of my 2014 WCQ H.A.T format deck profiles. The deck I want to show off today is Artifact Gravekeeper or Gravekeeper Artifact. It's a really cool and fun deck to play, and it's a really strong deck as a whole, despite it being a fairly old deck. Gravekeepers have been around for such a long time, but with the addition of the artifacts, the deck is actually very solid. There's a few changes I'd probably make in this build specifically that I'll talk about at the end of the video, so you're definitely going to want to stick around to the end. But without further ado, let's get into this deck profile, as I know a lot of people have asked me for this, so let's get started. So the first card I want to talk about in this deck profile is I am playing 3 copies of Necrovalley. Now, Necrovalley is a card, it's a field spell card that the whole deck sort of revolves around. You want to get to this as quickly as possible, and Necrovalley as a whole is probably one of the cards with the most erratas in the game's history for the most part. And so the first thing I want to talk about is just what the errata for this card is during H.A.T format, and it is the copy that you see here that says, all Gravekeeper's monsters gain 500 attack and defense, which is good to get a bit of boost since some of the monsters are a little weak, but with the 500 actually become pretty sizable. Then all cards in either player's graveyard cannot be banished. So that means any type of card, spell, trap, monster. So against decks like the Dragon Rulers that a lot of time need to use their graveyard as a resource to banish cards, they won't be able to do that. As well as, you can't get your cards DD crowed, which is always a problem for the artifact monsters. Your opponent can't use, a handful of other cards. But the second part is the big difference for this card as well. It's negate any card effect that would move a card in the graveyard other than itself to a different place. So what that means is, for example, if you had a artifact monster in graveyard, it can still special summon itself out because it's leaving the graveyard with its own effect. Though a card like Call the Haunted that would summon a monster from graveyard will not be able to activate. So that is a very key thing, and that's why the artifacts actually work in this deck. And just in general, as I mentioned, it's a great card against, say, decks like the Rulers, against decks like Infernity that have cards like Launcher, Necromancer, etc. that would move cards out of the graveyard. It's good against decks like Spellbook that, take spells from the graveyard or banish spells from the graveyard. Just overall, it's very good against a lot of the top decks, and that's why it can compete really well. But anyways, let's move on to the monsters. We play 3 copies of Gravekeeper Commandant. This one, you're able to discard it to the graveyard and add a copy of Necrovalley from your deck to your hand. So just easy access to Necrovalley. After that, 3 copies of Gravekeeper Recruiter. This one, if this card you control is sent to the graveyard, you can add a Gravekeeper monster with 1500 or less defense from your deck to your hand. This can add almost any Gravekeeper that we play in the deck except for the next one. But also it's not once per turn, so if you have multiple, you're able to, search multiple times as they're destroyed, so very good. And the one that you can't search is the copy of Gravekeeper Spy. Most people know this card. It's played in a ton of different formats. And what it does is when it's flip summon, you special summon a Gravekeeper monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck. So this can summon a whole bunch of things, and just in general, it's a way to kind of get monsters out of your deck. It can also help you make rank 4s and other things. So just a very powerful card. With Necrovalley, it becomes a 2500 defense position monster, which is very hard for a lot of decks to out. And then the last Gravekeeper monster I play is one that people might not be as familiar with, and that is Gravekeeper Shaman. This one is very important to be able to summon off of your Spy, and it kind of gives Necrovalley its more modern effect. So what this one does is it gains 200 defense for each Gravekeeper monster in your graveyard, and then the secondary effect is really crazy, which is negate all monster effects that activate in the graveyard except Gravekeeper's monsters. So that stops, so many different grave effects against decks like Mermail, for example. That's huge, and just so many decks in H.A.T format have grave effects. So being able to lock that down is great. Now that does sort of conflict with your artifacts, but we don't play the biggest artifact package, and when I talk about some of the changes I would make in the future, this card just becomes so much more relevant. And then even after that, while Necrovalley is on the field, your opponent cannot activate field spell cards. Also, field spell cards cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. So this is really good since in H.A.T format, there's only one field spell zone. So say your opponent has a field spell, I activate mine will destroy theirs. So vice versa, if I have Necrovalley, they won't be able to activate other field spells to get rid of the Necrovalley, and then they can't destroy it by opponent's card effects. This card is really good. In the past, I've tried playing one copy of Gravekeeper's Descendant, which lets you tribute a Gravekeeper monster to pop a card on the field. It's really good against, decks that are playing Vanity's Emptiness or just to out problematic Floodgates or anything like that. But I found it takes too much setup right away, and this is sort of a brick, so I didn't want to play two semi-bricks, in a sense, in the deck, and that's why I chose this over the copy of Descendant. But that's it for the Gravekeepers. For the artifact monsters, I play 2 copies of Artifact Madolche, 1 copy of Artifact Scythe, and 1 copy of Beagletech. Usually this deck does play 4 artifacts, though a lot of times they will just play the 3rd Madolche. Now, I chose to play the Scythe instead because I found a lot of decks that can spam out rank 4s or just spam out Xyz are usually the bigger problems with this deck, especially if they don't rely on the graveyard. So a deck like Infernity that revolves around the graveyard a lot of times because of cards like Necromancer and Launcher that I mentioned previously, or even cards like Stygian Street Patrol, this deck has a problem against those decks because they also play a lot of ways to make rank 4s and things that don't need the graveyard. So what I mean by that is, say, Infernity can do like Summoner Monk, discard a spell, summon another 4, and make a Direwolf or an Exciton or something, and kind of easily clear your Necrovalley. Same with decks like that are a bit more rogue that play Kagado Kage, such as like your Spirit Control decks, your Ghostrix Spirits, your Gadgets. Different decks like that can be kind of a problem for this deck, like because you are having a field spell and, in general, other cards like Ragna Zero can hurt this deck because of Necrovalley giving your monsters a boost. So I wanted to play the Scythe just to kind of counteract those decks before they get to that point. But in general, I think the artifacts are really good because they have the interaction with Necrovalley still being able to summon out and your opponent can't crow them. But there is a little bit of downside with this that, again, I'll talk about towards the end of the video, or at least the end of the deck profile. But yeah, I've been liking that engine though, and it works out really well. And then I am playing 2 more monsters, and those are 2 copies of Skullmeister. Now, besides things like Exciton that can hurt this deck, another thing that can kind of hurt this deck are the hands, because the hands, as long as you don't have the one that will, negate the different cards in graveyard, if you just have a basic Necrovalley play, the hands can really hurt. So Skullmeister during H.A.T format and in general, you can discard it during damage step, which is really key, so you can negate the hands, as well as other graveyard type effects. For example, if your opponent, say, summons an Undyne and sends a copy of Heavy Infantry that pops face up cards, you can negate that. And there's just a ton of other graveyard effects that kind of play around Necrovalley and can easily out Necrovalley, and that's why I chose Meister. Some people will choose to play like a Trap Tricks engine, for example, but one of the reasons that I don't exactly like the artifacts that, again, I'll talk about at the end, is kind of similar, and it's a main thing is you can't really take advantage fully of all the effects of, say, a Mermail, like bringing it back and popping cards, because Necrovalley will prevent that in most cases. So I just think Skullmeister is really good in the main. For other spells, again, we do play the 3 Necrovalley, 3 copies of Pot of Duality, just because this is a slightly slower deck, and so Duality, being able to search all your stuff when you're not really special summoning on your turn, is really good. 3 copies of Artifact Ignition, we're playing artifacts and back row removal is really good. And the last spell I play is 1 Dark Hole, just because going second can be a little bit of a problem, and Dark Hole just kind of clears the way. For the traps, we play, obviously, 3 copies of Artifact Sanctum to summon your artifacts from deck, as well as if your opponent, say, destroys it when trying to clear your back row, you can then pop a card on the field. 2 copies of Rite of Spirit. This is basically Call the Haunted for your Gravekeeper monsters, and it does have the effect that it can't be negated by Necrovalley, so this does play around Necrovalley. I've considered 3 of this, but I think it's a little cloggy at times, so I think 2 is the perfect amount. After that, 2 copies of Deprison. The reason I play Deprison is, again, because the hands can be a problem against this deck, and just in general, there are decks that can put out big bodies. After that, 2 copies of Fiendish Chain. I've considered bumping this to 3. Again, this is a way to stop your guys from being destroyed by battle, since it'll stop your opponent from being able to attack with that monster. It's also effect negation, so again, it works against H.A.T and those cards that I mentioned previously as well. And this deck can't really play Breakthrough Skill or anything, because it would, after you have the on-field effect, you can't banish it because of Necrovalley. I also really like Fiendish Chain in decks where you already have targeted back row that your opponent will want to get rid of, because that means if your opponent wastes all their back row removal on, say, your Necrovalleys, it means your Fiendish Chains will always be able to activate, and vice versa. If they waste it on this, then your Necrovalleys will always be live, which is nice. After that, 1 Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare, 1 Solemn Warning, 1 Compulse, 1 Torrential, and 1 Bottomless Trap Hole to round out the main deck. For the extra deck, we play 1 copy of Gaia Dragon to stack on top of your rank 5s, 1 Tyrus, because it's just a really good card, 1 Pleiades, and 1 Volcasaurus for the rank 5s. I'm currently not playing Durendal. I go back and forth with wanting to play it. The problem I found is Durendal, it has the effect to switch in a normal spell, trap, or monster effect to make your opponent pop a back row. But the thing is it just says pop a spell or trap, so they can actually pop your Necrovalley. And I don't like the idea of that, giving them the option to do that. So that's why I'm choosing not to play it. But I have played it in the past, and it's been pretty alright. So I might go and put it back. For the rank 4s, we play 1 copy of Key Beetle. Key Beetle locking your Necrovalley is a good way to protect it, amongst other things, and just it's a good card. 1 Karen Gorgon, because it's a big body, and again, you can change targeting. 1 Ragna Zero, 1 Black Ship of Corn, 1 101, 1 Heartland Draco, 1 Exciton, 1 Dweller, and 1 Cowboy to end games quickly. And then I play 2 rank 3s, 1 copy of Acid Golem, and then 1 copy of Nightmare Shark. This is basically just a rank 3 version of Heartland Draco, just because, again, this deck needs to end games as quickly as it can. So the changes that I've been thinking about kind of come in with the artifact engine. And let me just pull out all the artifact stuff real quick so I can explain it. So how I was mentioning how some builds play things like Mermail and cards like that, the problem I have is, like, when you play the Traptrix engine, you're not able to play cards like Dionea, because Dionea would move a card from the graveyard with its own effect, so it would get negated by your Necrovalley, so you can't take advantage of it. And one of the best parts of the Traptrix engine, in my opinion, is being able to special summon back the Mermail and pop a back row with it. And so that kind of goes same with the artifact package, in my opinion, where it's really good, but the problem is not being able to play cards like Call of the Haunted and Soul Charge and things and really take advantage of the artifacts, being able to special summon them back with, say, Call of the Haunted and get an additional pop, or reuse the Scythe, or if your opponent stops the Beagle Tech and you have these set, it just becomes kind of a problem. And so the other thing is we're only playing 4 artifacts, meaning if we see multiple copies of Sanctum, multiple Ignition, you have to set off of Ignition, and for this to be good, you have to be able to summon. Also, if you hard open these, it makes so more of these are less live. So what I've kind of considered is, while this can be really good. I've considered dropping the ratios down quite a lot. I've considered cutting a Beagle Tack and cutting Ignition as a whole, and if I cut Ignition, I would probably swap them out for just regular MSTs. That way, I have an equal chance of seeing these and the Sanctums, and it's not the worst if I open one of these, again, because I will be having MST, and then I don't have to worry about these interacting with these or hard opening these, as well as you do reach the problem that I said before, is sometimes you really want to go for your Beagle Tech play, but your opponent will say breakthrough skill this or something, and then it kind of just leaves you with these dead on the field, and it feels like it interacts really well, but really bad at the same time. If you want to play the whole package, definitely go for it. It's not bad. I've just been having a little bit of the issue with, I prefer to play artifacts in decks where I can take full advantage of them, as well as, like, because we're not playing Call of the Haunteds and stuff, Pleiades doesn't do as much because I can't recycle my own resources and get extra advantage out of it. Maybe that's just me, but test it for yourself, see what you think. And anyways, guys, that is it for this deck profile. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on it, comment any questions or videos you'd like to see in the future, share this video with your friends, all that good stuff. Again, like, comment, subscribe, share, and I will see you in the next video.